And now on the Joe Bev Show, yours truly, Johnny Dollar, in the James Forbes matter. Johnny Dollar.
Roger Stern, Dollar.
Hello, Mr. Stern. What can I do for you?
We insure Mr. James Forbes. He was killed last night.
Accident?
It looks that way, but there's always the chance it might not be. Can you take the job?
Sure. How about the details?
Come on down to the office as soon as you can, and I'll give you what we've got.
I'll catch the first train out.
The transcribed adventures of the man with the action-packed expense account, America's fabulous freelance insurance investigator.
Yours truly, Johnny Dollar. Expense account submitted by Special Investigator Johnny Dollar to Home Office, Intercontinental Indemnity and Bonding Corporation, New York City. The following is an accounting of the expenditures during my investigation of the James Forbes matter. Expense account item 1, $13.95, train fare and incidentals between Hartford and New York City. After receiving from you the details regarding the death of James Forbes, I registered to the hotel and went directly to the 5th Precinct Police Station and interviewed Lieutenant Arthur Parkhill, who was handling the case.
Well, there isn't much more to tell you, Mr. Dollar, other than what you know.
You're convinced that it was an accident?
I'm convinced he fell over the edge of a 110-foot cliff, that it looks like an accident. It certainly doesn't mean the case is closed, but so far there's no motive for murder.
There's a wife.
Yeah.
Mr. Forbes had quite a bit of money.
That's an understatement. Mr. Forbes was loaded.
And Mrs. Forbes gets to keep everything, including a $500,000 insurance policy.
Look, that's the first thing we considered, but just because a husband's got money and a great big fat insurance policy...
Wait a minute. I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job.
Of course you're not. Of course you're not. But there's a lot of guys in the world with money, and a lot of them are married. Some of them stay married. Some of them get divorced. Very few of them get murdered. We checked the wife. Checked her good. The way it looks, she liked being married. She was in love with her husband. When he went over the cliff, she was in the house. 4 servants can swear to it.
He just fell over the cliff.
According to everything we can find out, he took long walks every night along the cliff by the ocean. Last night, it was unusually foggy. It's certainly possible he got too close to the edge, missed his footing, and did a high dive.
How about suicide?
At least there's no reason we can come up with. Good health, business doing better than it ever has.
Textiles, isn't it?
Yeah. The biggest in the country. There's absolutely nothing that indicates suicide. Especially no suicide note. And there usually is.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like your company's going to have to pay off.
Yeah, it looks that way, doesn't it? The Forbes estate is on the island, isn't it?
Yeah. They're going to take a run-up?
Thought I might. Thanks for your help. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you, Dollar. Let me know if you come across anything.
Sure. Expense account item 2, 75 cents cab fare to a local garage where I rented a car. The drive to the island was pleasant for that time of year. The humidity had dropped and a cool breeze was blowing in off the Atlantic. The Forbes mansion stood in the middle of a lot of acreage along the shore of the northeastern end of the island. The last 3 miles of the road to the house ran along the cliffs, over 100 feet straight down to the rocks below. Somewhere along that road, the rich Mr. Forbes had met his death. As I walked up to the front door, I could smell the ocean, and the sun felt warm on the back of my neck. 100 yards down on the green sloping front lawn, a big collie dog stretched and looked up at me. A gardener stood leisurely watering a huge flower bed of roses. It seemed like the wrong kind of day to be investigating death. I'd like to see Mrs. Forbes, please.
I'm afraid Mrs. Forbes is seeing no one.
Tell her Mr. Dollar is here. I believe Mr. Stern from my company called Mrs. Forbes and told her I was coming out.
Mr. Dollar?
That's right.
If you would wait a moment.
Sure. Take your time. The butler went to find Mrs. Forbes, and I turned around and faced the sun. I leaned against the door jamb and watched a seagull circling over the cliffs. I closed my eyes and hoped the lieutenant had been right. Just an accident. Nothing left for me but a routine report. But it was that kind of day.
Oh, yeah. Mrs. Forbes will see you. Mrs. Forbes was expecting you, but neglected to tell me. Mr. Dollar.
Come in, Mr. Dollar. I'm Mrs. Forbes.
How do you do?
Won't you sit down?
Thank you.
Can I get you a drink?
No thanks.
Some lunch?
No thanks.
Mr. Stern called and said you were coming out. He seemed to think it was necessary.
Routine. Unfortunately, in a matter like this.
Routine? I understand.
Better to get it over with.
I suppose so.
Just a few questions. What time did Mr. Forbes leave the house last night?
Right after dinner, around 9.
I understand he was in the habit of taking walks.
Yes.
Last night was the same as any other night?
Yes.
He seemed all right?
He was fine. Wonderful spirits.
Who found him?
The police.
You called them?
Yes. After he'd been gone longer than usual, I began to worry. By 12 o'clock, I sent William, my butler, out in the car to look for him. When William returned, I had him call the police. They didn't find him until morning.
You're convinced it was an accident?
My husband didn't commit suicide, Mr. Dollar.
Did he have any enemies?
No. No one killed him, Mr. Dollar. Now, if you don't mind, I really don't feel too well.
Of course. There's just one more thing.
Yes?
I'd like to take a look at the place, the spot.
I'll have William show you.
Thanks.
I'm sorry I can't be more help, Mr. Dollar, but there's nothing to help you with. My husband was killed in an accident. He wasn't murdered, and he didn't commit suicide. My husband was a fine and a wonderful man. I loved him very much.
Sure.
I'll call William and have him drive you down to the cliffs. It's been nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you. And I'm sorry.
So am I.
I watched her go. A darned attractive woman who seemed genuinely shocked over her husband's sudden death. In a few moments, the butler returned, and I followed him out to my car. Then we drove away from the house toward the cliff. It's a terrible thing.
Yes, sir.
How long have you been with the Forbes?
10 years, sir.
Good marriage?
Yes, sir. It's about another 100 yards, sir. You can stop here. Right over there. They found Mr. Forbes right down there, sir.
Long drop.
Yes, sir.
Well, I guess under the circumstances it would be pretty easy to miss your footing along here.
It was very foggy last night.
Yeah. Well, come on. I'll drive you back.
Mr. Dollar? Mr. Dollar, I really don't know quite how to say this. I've nothing really to go on except, well, I'm not convinced Mr. Forbes' death was an accident.
Why aren't you?
It's hard to say. Until this morning, until some time after they found him, I didn't think it could be anything else. When the police questioned me, I never even considered another possibility. But Mr. Forbes has been taking walks at night, every night, since I came to work. He's walked in all kinds of weather. He knew these cliffs from one end to the other.
People take showers in the same shower year after year. Certain percentage of them slip and break their necks.
It's not just the walks, and the fact that Mr. Forbes was so familiar with these cliffs. It's a lot of little things that have happened over the past 2 or 3 months.
What kind of things?
Well, individually they weren't even enough to notice, but since this morning I began to kind of collect them, remember them and store them up as it were. Nothing really definite. Telephone calls.
What kind of telephone calls?
Several times Mrs. Forbes has made calls. Several times I happened to overhear part of the conversation. They were affectionate.
Affectionate?
I thought she was talking to Mr. Forbes, But several times I discovered through dinner conversations between Mr. and Mrs. Forbes that she hadn't spoken to him during the day, that he'd been out of the city, or, well, it's really awfully hard to explain.
How affectionate were these calls?
Quite.
You think Mrs. Forbes has been playing around?
I don't know, but that brings up something else. Now, I know Mrs. Forbes pretty well after 10 years. Up until 7 months ago, her routine never faltered. She had her bridge parties, weekend guests, nothing different.
Something changed.
One thing. Generally, when Mr. Forbes left town for any length of time, Mrs. Forbes would content herself with the usual routine, have friends out to the house, an occasional visit in town. But in the last few months, when Mr. Forbes left, she'd inform me she was going to town to visit with friends, and she'd very seldom return until the day before Mr. Forbes was supposed to be back from his trip. On one of these occasions, Mrs. Weatherwax, the woman Mrs. Forbes was supposed to be visiting, came to the house calling on Mrs. Forbes. From her conversation, I gathered she hadn't seen Mrs. Forbes for some time.
Did you say anything about it?
To whom? Mrs. Forbes? Naturally not. I didn't think that much about it at the time.
Anything else?
Only things that are hard to put into words. The way Mrs. Forbes acted when Mr. Forbes was not in the house. Nervous, apprehensive, and still it might just be my imagination. What with the shock of Mr. Forbes' death and all, I might just be exaggerating things that really aren't important.
It's possible.
Yes, sir, but I suddenly felt that I must tell someone. If Mrs. Forbes should find out, she'd surely dismiss me, and I couldn't blame her.
I'm not going to say anything.
Thank you.
Come on, we better start back.
I hope I haven't started something I'll be sorry for.
Do me a favor.
Certainly.
If Mrs. Forbes gets any more of those phone calls, see if you can find out who's on the other end of the line.
I'll try.
You can reach me at the Madison Hotel.
Yes, sir.
I drove William back to the house, then headed my rented car for the city. It was close to 5 o'clock when I got back to my hotel and called Lieutenant Parkhill. I told him about my conversation with the butler, and he was interested. He agreed to do some more checking on Mrs. Forbes' friends, especially the men. Expense account item 3, $7.50, dinner, after which I took a short walk, then returned to my hotel to get a good night's sleep. I was just turning off the light when the phone rang. Yeah?
Mr. Dollar,
That's right.
this is William, Mr. Forbes' butler.
Yes, William.
Mrs. Forbes received a phone call about a half an hour ago.
From the same party?
I'm not sure, but I think so.
You find out who it is?
No, sir.
Well, that's not going to help much.
I thought you could discover his identity.
How could I do that?
Mrs. Forbes just left the house. I overheard her agree to meet the party in the city.
Where in the city?
I don't know, but I thought you could intercept Mrs. Forbes as she comes off the George Washington Bridge.
William, you have the soul of a Sherlock.
Yes, sir. Mrs. Forbes is driving the gray Cadillac sedan, license number 3J-8873.
It took me 5 minutes to get back into my clothes and make it down to my car. 20 minutes after that, I was parking at the city side entrance of the Washington Bridge, watching for Mrs. Forbes to show up in her gray Cadillac. I waited about a half an hour. She came off the bridge doing a little better than the allowed speed limit and turned north. I started tailing her. I stayed about a block behind, and Mrs. Forbes led me across the town. Suddenly, at the corner of 41st and 5th, she pulled up to the curb, and a man stepped up to the car, quickly opened the door, and climbed in. Mrs. Forbes drove away, and I continued to follow. I followed for about another hour, while Mrs. Forbes just drove around, obviously heading for no place in particular, just talking things over with her passenger. About 11:30, she had made a left turn, cut back across town and pulled up in front of an address on 108th Street. Her passenger got out, said something, threw her a quick kiss, and went into the building as I parked a half a block away and turned off my lights. After Mrs. Forbes had driven her gray Cadillac out of sight, I went down to the building the man had entered and took a look at the mailboxes. There were 6 apartments listed, most of them occupied by families. There was only one single man's name on the mailbox, Mr. Roger Phillips, Apartment B.
Homicide, Park Hill.
I thought maybe you'd be off duty.
Just going off. Who is this?
Johnny Dollar.
Hi. What now?
Right after I talked to you this evening, the Forbes butler called me and told me Mrs. Forbes was coming into town, that she'd gotten another phone call from Mr. X. I tailed her from the Washington Bridge and she picked up a man. They drove around for about an hour and she dropped him off at 53 East 108th Street. I think his name is Roger Phillips.
Roger Phillips?
You know him?
I don't know. Name's familiar. I'll check on it.
Well, there's 5 other names on the mailbox, but they're all families.
53 East 108th?
Yeah.
I'll have them all checked. Where are you?
In a drugstore around the corner. Hey,
What?
cab just pulled up in front.
Of the drugstore?
No, 53 East. I can see it through the wind. Oop.
What?
I'll call you later. My man just came out. He's getting into a cab. Bye. The cab was 2 blocks away and turning left by the time I was able to follow. It led me across town to the waterfront and a small tired saloon named the Blue Toad. I watched while the man paid off his driver. Then I followed him into the dive. The Blue Toad was 1 room, a few tables, and a bar. The customers were off the waterfront. Seamen, stevedores, and bums with saltwater faces and an occasional tattoo. The air smelled like stale beer, live bait, and bad tobacco. I watched my man cut his way through the heavy blue haze and sit down. Another man sat at the table, a short man with a dark face. I found a table near the door, gave my order to a waiter with a crusty apron, and relaxed to see what was going to happen.
Hello.
Oh,
You alone?
yeah, but,
Buy me a drink, huh?
sure, what'll it be?
Champagne. Doesn't that get a laugh?
Was it supposed to?
Well, if I was a nice-looking guy wearing a nice-looking suit and I just walked into this dump and a dame like me ordered champagne, forget it. I was just trying to start a conversation.
You started it.
I work on percentages. Buy me a scotch and I'll leave you alone.
Relax, I'm not expecting anybody.
Thanks.
You got any influence with the waiter? I ordered a drink 10 minutes ago.
He's probably out in the alley. He isn't well. About this time of night, he can't stand the smoke and goes out to stock up on fresh air. He'll be right back.
What's your name?
Jane. Yours should be, Mike. Or Bill. Yeah, you look kind of like a Mike.
Why?
I don't know. Feeling you get when you look at some people. Some people look like certain names.
It's Johnny.
Johnny?
Doesn't fit?
I guess so. Who are you watching, Johnny?
What makes you think I'm watching somebody?
Because you are. You've been watching those 2 guys in the back.
Okay.
Cop? The good-looking one just passed Tiny a bundle of money.
You know the dark little guy?
Forget it, huh?
Tell me about Tiny.
Tell me about Johnny.
I'm not a cop.
No. No, a cop wouldn't know all about Tiny. The good-looking one's leaving.
I'm interested in Tiny.
In Tiny or the money he's just got?
Both.
You're not a stick-up man, Johnny.
Not a bit.
I'd like to help, but Tiny finds out about things. Tiny's a bad boy. Hasn't got a friend in the world. Not even me. Leaving?
Yeah. Here, buy some champagne.
Thanks. Goodbye, Johnny.
I left her staring at the table. I didn't want to know what she was thinking about. Outside, the air was fresh and clean. I got in my car, lit a cigarette, and waited for the dark little man named Tiny to come out. In about 5 minutes, he did. He crossed the street and climbed into a car. He drove west, and I followed. About 10 minutes later, I stopped and watched Tiny park in an all-night garage, then crossed to a hotel called the Bayview. He went in, and I found a phone and called Lieutenant Parkhill.
Tiny?
About 5'9", dark complexion, dresses a little too sharp.
Tiny Collins.
What about him?
Bad boy.
So I've heard.
Assassin. But nobody's been able to prove it. I didn't even know he was in town. He shouldn't be.
Why not?
Old rap. Forgery.
Find anything on Roger Phillips?
Yeah. The socialite playboy. Makes the columns about once or twice a week. Never very flattering.
Does he know Mrs. Forbes?
He might. He runs around in that circle. He's been in town for about a year now. It comes from,
What?
I was going to say he comes from Cleveland.
Yeah?
Just remembered. So does Tiny Collins.
Might mean something.
Yeah, it might. If a guy from Cleveland wanted to hire a killer,
Did you check on Phillips in Cleveland?
kickback hasn't come in yet. Won't get in till tomorrow morning. The only thing we've got on him here is what I've already told you.
What are you going to do about Tiny?
Let him alone for a while. Stake out the hotel and see what he's up to. What are you going to do?
Go back to my hotel and get some sleep. I'm bushed.
Talk to you in the morning.
Yeah. On my way back to my hotel, I tried to put the whole thing together, and it seemed to make pretty good putting together. It was possible Mrs. Forbes was involved with the young, good-looking playboy Roger Phillips. Perhaps they had decided to get rid of Mr. Forbes. According to Lieutenant Parkhill, the little dark man named Tiny was a known assassin, and I had witnessed Roger Phillips pass him a big stack of money, possibly a payoff for shoving Forbes off the cliff. Yeah, it all made pretty good sense. But there wasn't 1 ounce of proof. I arrived at my hotel, went upstairs, and crawled into bed. Expense account item 4, 65 cents, breakfast the next morning, with Lieutenant Parkhill at a waffle shop across the street from the precinct.
Roger Phillips skipped Cleveland owing a lot of money. The Cleveland report gives him a clean police record, but one thing's pretty interesting. Most of the money he owed was for gambling debts. He owed it to Tiny Collins.
Huh.
Unless we've wandered too far off in left field, I've got a hunch Tiny killed Forbes, met him on that lonely road by the cliffs, and gave him a shove.
I've got the same hunch. Mrs. Forbes falls for Phillips, and together they plan to eliminate the husband. Phillips makes a deal with Tiny. Maybe agrees to give him a big interest on the debt when he marries Mrs. Forbes and gets his hands on all that money. Does Phillips have enough money to pay for a job like that?
If he doesn't, he probably borrowed it from Mrs. Forbes.
Yeah, it was a big stack of bills. Why don't you check with Mrs. Forbes' banks and see if she withdrew a large amount in the last couple of days?
You're right. You want some more coffee?
No. I think I'll make a call on Roger Phillips. Maybe I can force this thing out in the open.
What are you going to tell him?
Enough to scare him, get him into action. When people get frightened, they get careless.
Yeah, but they can get dangerous, too. You watch yourself.
Like a hawk. Roger Phillips was still sleeping when I knocked on the door. I kept pounding until he opened it and squinted at me through puffy eyes. I introduced myself, and he shoved me into a well-furnished small apartment. He put on some coffee, lit a cigarette, and sat down on the couch.
This is a little early for me, Mr.
Dollar.
Yeah. Sit down. The coffee won't take long. You're an insurance investigator.
That's right.
Well, I don't understand. What do you want to talk to me about?
Mrs. Forbes.
Mrs. Forbes?
You know her, don't you?
Mrs. Forbes? Well, I know one Mrs. Forbes.
Casually. I'm not going to play with you, Mr. Phillips. I'm talking about the Mrs. Forbes who picked you up last night and gave you a large amount of money. Look, I don't know what this is all about. I think you do. I said I didn't. I was in my apartment all last night. Nobody picked me up. And certainly nobody gave me any money. You went to a dump called the Blue Toad, and you met a man named Tiny. You're in big trouble, friend. I know all about Cleveland and Tiny Collins and Mrs. Forbes, and I think when Mrs. Forbes finds out about the deal you made with Tiny, she'll tell me everything. We'll see each other again. Your coffee's boiling over. Well, I'd given him the bait. A lot of hunches, but from his reactions, I was sure I'd scored. I went downstairs, crossed the street to the drugstore, waited 5 minutes to give Roger enough time to make his calls, then I slid into the phone booth and made a call of my own.
Mrs. Forbes' residence?
William, this is Mr. Dollar.
Oh, yes, sir. I was going to call you.
Did Mrs. Forbes just receive a call?
Yes, sir. Just a minute ago. It was from the same man. She's going to meet him.
Where?
By the cliffs.
Phillips had taken the bait. Only 2 people could implicate him in Forbes' murder, Mrs. Forbes and Tiny. And he called Mrs. Forbes to meet him by the cliffs. I put in another call to Lieutenant Parkhill.
Well, that's right, Johnny. The stakeout has a tap on Tiny's phone. Phillips just called him and said to pick him up as soon as he could. Phillips told Tiny there was trouble, that some guy named Dollar had found out about the whole setup. Shame on you.
If we want to stop a couple of killings, we better get right out there.
A couple of killings?
Sure. Phillips lets Tiny take care of Mrs. Forbes. Then he takes care of Tiny. It's the only way he can protect himself.
Pick you up in 5 minutes. Oh, by the way, I checked with the bank. Mrs. Forbes made a withdrawal day before yesterday. $10,000.
The lieutenant was as good as his word. In 5 minutes, he pulled his squad car up in front of the drugstore and I got in. The drive was fast. We swung off the main road on the island and headed up the private one to the Forbes estate about 2:30 in the afternoon. Halfway to the house, we spotted Mrs. Forbes walking along the road by the cliffs. We stopped, and she looked startled as we got out. Hello, Mrs. Forbes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dollar.
You've met Lieutenant Parkhill.
Yes, hello, Lieutenant. I was just taking a walk.
To meet Roger Phillips?
I beg your pardon?
We know all about it, Mrs. Forbes.
All about what, Lieutenant?
Your husband's death, who killed him, why he was killed.
I'm afraid I don't understand. My husband was not.
Roger Phillips will be along any minute. The man he paid to kill your husband will be with him. I think he intends to kill you.
This is the most ridiculous.
Mrs. Forbes, Roger Phillips left Cleveland owing a large gambling debt to a hoodlum named Tiny Collins. Last night you picked up Mr. Phillips and gave him $10,000, which he in turn gave to Collins.
We think he made another deal with Tiny. After he married you, he could pay off his gambling debt with interest.
Might as well tell us about it, Mrs. Forbes. He doesn't care about you. You and Tiny are the only ones that can implicate him. And he's on his way here right now to see that you don't.
I don't believe you.
Then find out for yourself. We'll duck the car behind those trees and give you plenty of protection when he gets here. Find out for yourself. Parkhill drove the car off the road behind the trees, stayed hidden, and waited for Phillips and Tiny. Mrs. Forbes stood quietly looking out to see her hands at her sides, bunched into small fists. She stood like that, not moving, even as the car came down the road heading right for her. Parkhill and I had our guns out as she turned and saw the car bearing down on her and picked up speed. Then she knew we weren't lying, but she didn't move, and the lieutenant and I went to work. The car was about 50 yards away, and then we stepped into the road. Tiny was driving and saw us the same instant Phillips did and tried to put on the brakes as we raised our guns.
Good gosh!
Yeah. I'm sorry it worked out that way.
He was going to kill me, wasn't he?
He sure was. Want to tell me about it?
Yes. Yes, it doesn't make much difference now, does it?
Nope. No, afraid it doesn't. Expense account item 5, $5.88, car rental and gas. Expense account items 6 and 7, $93.75, hotel bill, train fare, and incidentals back to Hartford. Expense account total, $148.48. Yours truly, Johnny Dollar. Yours truly, Johnny Dollar, in the James Forbes matter here on The Joe Bev Show. Please subscribe to The Joe Bev Show on YouTube. And if you can't get enough, just go to Amazon.com and search for Joe Bev.